So once we've decided on the animation we want and we're ready to move on to the next phase, the next thing we want to do is we actually want to bake the animation onto our rig. So I want to make sure that my character is still on Cave Troll, my source is still on Ken character, and I'm going to go to Edit, Bake, to Control Rig. Now you can leave pretty much this all default. You just want to make sure your timeline is a little bit longer than the animation. If you ever want to see how long the animation is, just click on one of the joints on little mocap dude, and you can see where the keyframe stopped. Just give yourself a little padding on the end. And like I said, make sure you're on Cave Troll, Source, Ken Character, and Bake. And what that's basically going to do is it's going to kill off the little mocap dude. It's going to put all those keyframes right onto our rig. So now our little mocap guy here is pretty much dead to us. Now you can go ahead and delete him out of the scene, but I like to keep him in there just in case I ever want to change the animation. Having him in there, I can just import in a new character or a new mocap file, rebake it to the control rig, and change the animation. So I just hide him. Oopsie, wrong one. And why are you hiding him instead of him? Why are you being difficult? There. So I just kind of hide him to get him out of the way. So now I actually have this baked to my character. Now the cool thing about the control rig is you can actually keyframe on top of the animation, but we'll get into that in a minute. The next thing we actually want to do is we actually want to bind our character. So I'm going to bring back up my polygons, and you're going to see that we have a little bit of an issue here. My geometry is down here and my rig's up here. Well, luckily for us, once you make a control rig, you get a couple more options here under source. You have none, which will basically take the control rig out of the equation and allow you to move around your rig. And you have stance, and stance will actually take you down to T-pose. And my fingers aren't aligned quite right here. Where do I still have some values? Aha. On the knuckles. I'm just going to zero these guys out. There we go. And same thing over on this side. I had some animation on my fingers. So I'm just going to zero these guys out. There we go. So now we're back to our T-pose. This will allow us to be able to actually bind the character. So to bind the character, we basically want to select all of our bind joints. And luckily we use the suffix _bind on all of our bind joints. So I can just go up here to my select by name window and do a star _bind. And that'll select all my bind joints for me. Then I can shift click on the skin and I can go to skin, bind skin, options. And I'm just going to kind of briefly go over these options. I know you've already bound a little bit, but that was months ago, so I'll go over them again. The first thing is bind to. You have joint hierarchy, selected joints, or object hierarchy. Joint hierarchy would be if you just want to select the hip joint, and it would select all the joints under it in that hierarchy. Object hierarchy would be if you had them all under a group node. You just grab the group node, it grabs all joints under that group node. Or selected joints are the ones you have selected. Well, dun da da, that's what we just did. We selected our bind joints, so we want to use selected joints. The next is bind method. You have closest and distance, closest and hierarchy, heat map, and geodesic voxel. Closest distance, closest hierarchy are the oldest ones. They've been around the longest. Basically, closest and distance gives you better shoulders and hips, worse fingers and toes. Closest and hierarchy gives you better fingers and toes, worse shoulders and hips. Heat map actually projects a photon from every joint and uses the distance that photon travels to determine which vertices should be controlled by which joints. Uh, this one's okay, but it usually tends to give you a really Gumby looking character. It spreads the weights out real far and makes you get really Gumby looking. Geodesic Voxel is the newest kit on the block. It's actually a holdover from 3D Studio Max, and it actually uses capsules around each joint. And where the capsules overlap is where it makes the merging areas, things like that. The method I'm going to teach you how to use, it really doesn't matter which one you use because you're going to destroy a lot of it anyways. But I like to use closest in hierarchy because I hate to paint fingers and toes. The next is skinning method. You have classic linear, dual quaternion, or blended. Just leave it on classic linear. Dual quaternion was invented to help with candy wrapping. You know, at the end of candy wrappers, you get that bow tie effect. And if you had a really complex, like wrist movement, sometimes that skin will bow tie up. Dual quaternion was invented to help prevent that. Next, you have normalized weights. You have none, interactive, and post. Leave it on interactive. Post normalization is the devil. Do not use. Bad, bad, nasty, nasty ickiness. Do not use. And I'll explain that a little bit more when we get into the actual weighting tools. Just leave it on interactive. Weight distribution is basically another place for closest in distance or closest in hierarchy. Let's call it distance or neighbors. I like to have my fingers better, so I'll leave it on neighbors. Allow multiple bind poses. Basically, what a bind pose is every time you click bind, Maya takes a snapshot of where every single joint is at. That's your bind pose. Now, if you ever want to add influences or remove influences, you have to be at that exact bind pose to be able to do that. Now, that's fine and dandy when you get better at things. But when you first start off, sometimes you may add an IK or something like that, and it moves a joint just a hair, then it won't allow you to add influences. So I say go ahead and allow multiple bind poses. That way, if you move something just a little bit by mistake, it's a little bit more forgiving. It'll still allow you to add or remove influences. Max influences. This is how many joints can affect each vert at the initial bind. Remember, you can change all these after the fact, but we're just talking about the initial bind. By default, it's set to 5. I never go above 3, and I'll show you why. If I look at a vert on the tip of my finger here, if I go back 3 bind joints, and usually these are about the closest joints in your body for a rig. 1, 2, 3. Now that's not saying Maya will always use 3, but you're allowing Maya to use 3. Now, do I really want this upper knuckle joint to affect the tip of my finger? Now imagine if I go up 4, 5, 6, 7. Now again, that's not saying Maya will use all those, but you're allowing Maya to use all those. Y'all should know by now you don't want to give Maya too much power and come back to haunt you. So I never go above 3. Now the next one is maintain max influence. I always uncheck this. You're going to have to uncheck it eventually anyways. Because keeping this checked basically says that if Maya decides 3 joints should affect a vert, 3 joints must always affect that vert. If Maya decides 1 joint should affect that vert, 1 joint must always affect that vert. Again, going back to my example of the tip of the finger, let's say Maya decides that all 3 of these joints should affect that vert. I only want 1 joint to affect that vert, just this one. So I don't want to maintain that max influence. The next one is remove unused influences. Now this basically says if Maya in its infinite wisdom decides that a joint shouldn't influence anything, it's going to pull that joint out of the bind. Well, I named it bind. I want it in the bind. So I always uncheck that. Now colorize skeleton is really personal preference. Basically, if you leave this checked, what it's going to do is it's going to give each joint its own unique color, and it's going to color the vertices the same color as whatever joint is influencing it the most. I personally don't like this because you get so many colors and so many shades and fuchsia versus mauve versus puce. I get confused. I just like grayscale, so I uncheck it. Include hidden selection on creation. We don't have anything hidden, so we really don't have to worry about it. And then the drop-off rate is how smoothly it transitions between things. I usually put this in the 7 to 8 range, usually like 7.5, 7.6, something like that. And then all we have to do is click dun, 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 bind skin. Bam! And it is now bound. Ha ha ha. So if I try to move it right now, I actually get weirdness. Well, that's because in my human IK, I'm still set on stance. Stance doesn't allow me to actually move my joints. It keeps it at stance. So if you want to move it around, once you get to stance, then switch it to none. And now I can move it around. And that is my awesome initial bind. Are you impressed? Yay! In the next video, we'll go ahead and go over some painting weights and some tips and tricks to actually make this start to look good.